Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my daily, almost daily, COVID-19 trends live stream. It's June 19th, and we're going to go over the trends for the countries of the world, states of the United States, and counties of California in three sections. The first section, the countries. Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my daily... Let me turn myself off, so now that I know my sound's working, so you don't have to hear the echo. All right, starting with the countries. As always, the United States in the lead in total cases. Brazil for many weeks now has been second, and Russia third. India moving up there, while the UK seems to be in decline. But let's move on to... Actually, I'm going to expand this window just a little bit so that these don't scroll. That's what I'm going to try to do at least. Hopefully that won't mess up my live stream even farther. One of these days I'll get this website working so it doesn't do this. But for now that seems to be working okay. Yeah, that seems to be working okay. As far as I can tell. If there's a problem with this, put it in the chat. Try to pay attention to the chat for a change. All right. So yes, total cases, total daily cases, all very well, but my focus tends to be on the daily cases per million, as well as the growth trends. So daily cases per million lets us compare different regions adjusted by population. On that, we see that Qatar is still the dominant, though. Those of you who've been watching this for a long time will remember that Qatar has been a very long, very problematic, very long time, very problematic country in total cases per million, and it is a pleasure to see Qatar peak and decline as it has over the past few weeks. Its neighbor Bahrain, I'm going to zoom in just on Bahrain here. There's some evidence that it too is peaking and declining. Just a couple days, not enough to really make a trend out of it, but Qatar certainly is doing a lot better. Chile, again, a little bit of a hint that Chile may be turning the corner, but 3 points isn't quite enough for me to say so. You can see there are these 3 points well below the trend line and descending, but you know, we had one of those here, for instance, as well, these 3 points, and that didn't go anywhere. So it takes 4 to say it's really a trend, but a glimmer of hope for Chile. And also, I'll just mention that anything over 200 is a pretty serious number. I call that a hotspot. Those 3 plus Oman and Armenia are the hotspots. Nothing else is. None of the big names. No Russia, no India, no United States, nothing in Europe is a hotspot. There are a few warm spots, quite a few warm spots really, but those 5 are the only hotspots, and they're all relatively small countries. The big countries either have gotten over it or maybe are yet to get it. But at this point, none of them, no big country is in serious trouble in daily cases per million. I guess I will take a peek briefly at the warm spots. Those between 100 and 200 warm spots. Warmest of all is Panama. That one certainly seems to be rising. The latest day is higher than the trend line. No evidence that that one's falling away. Saudi Arabia also rising, warm and rising. Sweden, always interesting to see that. Moldova, warm and rising. And then we see a few warm and falling, like Peru and Kuwait, which seem to be recovering nicely. And then Brazil, which is showing signs, pretty good signs, that it also is headed for recovery. On our rope chart, we will see, no doubt, that Brazil is still trending, has crossed the 0 and is trending downward. This trend line doesn't show it yet because this trend line is fairly conservative and doesn't tend to bend as fast as I would if I were drawing the trend line. But in this case, I'm not sure that's really obvious. We've had a couple of pretty high days, even in just the past 3, so it's not totally clear that Brazil is turning a corner. Still, if we look at it on the rope chart, the growth chart, shows that Brazil has turned a corner, best guess has turned a corner, and is shrinking at about 1% per day. So lots of hot and warm countries, many of them still rising at least slightly, some of them falling. But I mean, Brazil is also quite large. So among these, just going to quickly pop in and see, remind myself what the population of Sweden is. But population in Brazil isn't too far off the United States, as I recall. A few hundred million. Population in Sweden is 10 million, which is the population of LA County, by the way. So Sweden is certainly not small, but it's no Brazil when it comes to size. So you really have to get down to Brazil or the United States in this list before we get to really large countries. What we have here is a lot of the large countries have gotten it, are recovering somewhat. Not so much the United States, by the way. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And what we have mostly left is a scattering of smaller ones. Not to say that one of the big countries might not rise up, but at this point, Brazil, it doesn't seem like it's going to be the one. It seems to be on its way to recovery. We are definitely going to focus on the United States, though, which is in some sense the worst country in the world right now when it comes to coronavirus. So looking individually at these are the 25 worst hit countries right now in terms of daily cases per million. Chile is recovering, it seems. Probably. It actually had a day of below, or in this day is the average of 7 days. These dots are actually the rolling 7-day average. And so this is, for 7 days straight, Chile has averaged 1.5% drop. So that sounds pretty good. It's some of its more recent days. I don't know what's up with that day. Did it really see a 73% average over 7 days? Well, so the data shows, but maybe that's a data error. Maybe that's an outlier. It certainly doesn't fit the curve, but it has pulled Chile's trend line upward for sure. So Chile does not look now like it's heading to zero as quickly as it used to, but we'll see. In any case, even with that terrible day, it's headed downward. Headed towards recovery, but not there yet, not yet turned the corner. Qatar, the worst for many weeks, turned the corner some weeks ago, a couple weeks ago, and is headed into very nice negative territory. Bahrain also appears to be turning the corner and seems to have turned the corner a few days ago, headed into negative growth. Oman headed downward, not quite there yet, not quite into negative growth, but clearly headed downward. Armenia, downward. Panama, downward, though not as nice as some of them. It's still seeing 3% growth, but the trend is downward. The last 2 days are looking pretty good, and the last week or so shows, I would say, a fairly clear downward mini trend. So downward. Peru, downward and negative. Kuwait, downward and negative. Kuwait was pretty bad, and now they have turned the corner. So it takes until Saudi Arabia before this trend line believes that we're actually accelerating. Now, I would say that any kindergartner would draw this as more of a sine wave. The trend line to me is obviously wrong. It tries its best, but I think it was kind of low or medium, and then it went up, and then it swooped down for a little bit, and then it went up, and then it swooped down. So I really think we have a wave here, and if that's true, there's a downward trend here. We have a downward trend for the past week in our rolling average. So I think this trend line is full of it. We don't usually see the trend lines disagree with me so much, but I think if you look at that, there's a better way to draw a trend line there than what Loez is doing. So arguably, even Saudi Arabia is trending downward. Brazil has turned the corner and is trending downward. Had a really good week. The latest day of the 7-day moving average says Brazil has dropped an average of 4% for the past week daily. Brazil seems to be recovering just recently. Sweden, not so much. It's flat. I would say this is the first one that I look at and say, okay, yeah, this really is arguably rising. It's a cloud of points. It's hard to say for sure, but I believe this trend line to be reasonable, and it says that Sweden is rising 4% a day. It's had one good day, but that doesn't mean anything. Had a really bad day right before that. So it takes that far down the list of hottest countries before we find one that looks anything but kind of good in its growth trajectory. These are already the third or fourth wave countries, and they're all recovering. You wouldn't quite see it from this graph because a lot of them seem to have upward lines, but on the rope chart, the trend of their growth rates is good. They may still be growing, but their growth rates are trending downward, and many of them are not even growing. Again, if we just click through all the ones we've looked at so far, we can see the trend is unmistakable. And again, I challenge that trend line for, was it Saudi Arabia? Yeah, for Saudi Arabia, I challenge it. It's the trend lines. The LOES is the algorithm that I use here to draw the trend lines, and I do not think it did the best trend line there. I think it's quite reasonable to say that all of the top 10 are trending downwards. They're all trending in a good direction, and half of them have already turned the corner and are actually shrinking of these hottest states. Now, we may see new ones come and take the place, and it looks like Sweden's kind of trying to be that new kid on the block in terms of hotness of cases, but other than that, the countries are looking good. Now, once we get down to Moldova, that really is, well, I don't know. It's so scattered, it's hard to say. One could argue that this is flat, but the trend line's guess is that it is accelerating. Macedonia is getting better, but still has growth. And then there's the United States. I don't think I'll go any further down the list, but the United States is showing a 2% growth rate. That's not good. We've seen much worse. It's showing a 2% growth rate, and it's showing its 3 most recent days are well above that at 3-ish%. So the United States arguably is the worst country in the world right now in this graph. This is choosing, we can certainly find countries that are growing faster than the United States, and indeed many of these ones are, I think. If we graph them all, the United States is just somewhere down there. So what do I mean that it's the worst country in the world? Well, if I were to choose between a country that has between living right now and a country that has a high growth rate that's dropping quickly or a medium growth rate that's rising, I think I'd take the high growth rate that's dropping, because that's a country that has an epidemic-free future. In all of these countries, with a few exceptions, we can also look at Honduras, Saudi Arabia. Well, I think that's the bad trend line. Moldova, those two are worse than the United States. Those are high growth rates and accelerating. But other than that, there's really no one in this top 25 of the hottest countries that's doing this upward trend where the growth rate is rising. So I think the United States has it kind of bad. As we've seen, there's the Gang of Six, the AAA states and 3 others that are doing quite badly in terms of growth rates, and they're pulling the United States upward here. So bummer to be in the United States. It'll get better eventually, I have no doubt, but right now, the United States is looking bad. But not terribly bad. I also need to step back to my usual place and say the United States, though it's in the top, no, this is the one I want, though it is in the top of the top 25 in terms of daily cases per million, it's still under 100. And that means it's cool in growth. It's not even warm. It's certainly not hot, which would be 200. So the United States, it has some runway here. I guess it has some runway to make a landing. It's not quite running up against the end of its runway. If it gets to 200 or 300 or 500 or 1,000, like New York did, for instance, then I'd say it really seems like it's kind of run out of runway, or at least it's a lot worse than the other places we've seen. But with the United States still low in the pack, still way behind a lot of other countries in total cases per million, it has some room to mess up, in a sense, mess up its growth rate and to see cases grow without it being a terrible calamity. So the growth situation for the United States is poor. It's very close to being a growth hotspot. which would be 2%. No, actually, I've been saying 5% is a growth hotspot, but it's quite warm. At 2%, that's well above the 1% cutoff to be a growth warm spot, but it's not actually a warm spot in total cases. It will take months for the United States to really heat up to the degree that New York did. It's just not going to happen. These 6 relatively small states are not going to do that. They're going to recover in a matter of weeks, I think, just like everything does, maybe in a couple months, and they will never pull the United States into being a world leader in daily cases per million. Looking at the rope chart for all the countries combined, we see there's the 0 line. I'm not going to look at individual countries here. I'm just looking at overall, what does this mess look like? What does it show us? It shows us that about half of countries are growing, about half of countries are shrinking. It's not really clear here whether the ones that are growing are accelerating. Certainly the fastest growers are accelerating and the fastest shrinkers are decelerating. But it's the rest is just a mess. We can't really tell. By the way, if you ever want to see how a particular country is doing, you can come to the website, gregferrer.us. There you'll be able to see this, and you'll be able to click on your favorite country. If Bosnia and I'm not going to try Herzegovina, I once knew how to pronounce that, is your cup of tea, you can look and say, they have a 5% growth rate and rising. Pretty bad, actually. Worse than, say, the United States, which for all that, how I was talking about how terrible it was, it's only terrible among the hottest countries. There are a lot of countries that are growing more than the United States. Like this is about where the United States is here at 1% or something. A lot of countries are growing faster, accelerating faster than the United States. They just don't have very many cases right now. They're not, or they're so tiny that I don't even include them in the graph, the top 25 graph above. So the world is kind of even. It's still growing. It had a really terrible day for some reason a couple days ago, but there's good news here in this graph. Slightly good news. The world is, first of all, no longer a warm spot. The world itself, if it were among all the planets in the universe and their COVID-19 epidemics to be compared, it previously was at 1.4%, which counts it as a warm spot. Now it's at 0.8%, which means it's no longer even a warm spot. It is pretty good in its daily percentage. 0.8 will certainly add up if it continues for months and months, but the other nice thing here is that is clearly declining now. It was 1.3, now it's 0.8. It's got maybe a few months at this rate before it hits 0 again. I think it was at 0 when I first started this, but at least it's declining again. So the world saw this very slight swelling of growth, and now it's getting better. Maybe worth noting the most recent day, which is a rolling average of 7 days, so this is really the most recent week in some sense, is negative growth, or very close to 0. The world for the past week as a whole has seen a negative growth, which is great. Yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time on testing. I don't usually anymore because everyone seems to be testing pretty well. There are no really terrible things to point out. Like I used to point out how terrible California's testing was. It isn't anymore. Let's move on to the states. So, in total cases, New York, New Jersey, New York's on top. It always will be. I don't think anyone's ever going to pass New York in total cases. New Jersey certainly isn't because it's flattening out way below New York. Theoretically, California could, but it would have to go for a long time on this upward trajectory as New York flattens out, and New York would have to not have any new second waves there for anyone to catch New York, for California to catch New York. But we can see with those green dots above the green line, California is accelerating. It's not looking great. Almost everyone else has green dots below the green line. California and Texas continuing to be the exception to that among the relatively large total cases states. Let's move on to daily cases per million, skipping over the actual total numbers of daily cases. Daily cases per million, I think, is more useful and being able to compare states. So we still have the Gang of Six here. You can see them pretty prominently. Well, first of all, notice there are a lot of states that seem to be rising here. There are a few, certainly. Rhode Island certainly has gotten over it. Maryland and Nevada were part of a month ago wave that is passing now. They're cooling. They were warm spots, maybe even hot spots briefly. Now they're no longer. Well, I guess Maryland is just barely still a warm spot at over 100 daily cases per million. But a lot of other states are part of this rising wave, and especially the Gang of Six. The AAA, Arizona, Arkansas, Alabama, are still looking pretty bad. Maybe we're seeing a little bit of good news in Alabama. We'll check the rope chart. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Utah also looking pretty bad. All of these are warm spots at this point. None of them are hot spots. They haven't gotten that bad. They will if they continue this for a few more weeks. But at this point, they're just something to look forward to, or looking forward, we can see that these states could have a problem. I wouldn't say they quite do yet, because they're not even hot yet, but they have a growth problem, but not a problem yet in cases by population. Remember, New York was at 1,400 on this scale. These are at a tenth of that. That's adjusted by population, so it's not just because New York's bigger. New York just had it a whole lot worse, even adjusted for population. And so, yes, these are all the news we can drum up right now, but that just means that the news is pretty lean. We don't have a lot of bad things to say, because there aren't a lot of states in bad shape. Rhode Island also was a news cycle, at least in my news program, for a month there, but Rhode Island's gotten over it. And this is all that's left, these tepid little states with barely warm number of cases. Let's look at them by growth, though, because if they're madly growing, then they certainly could become problems. Maybe we'll throw in Florida here as well, because people just keep talking about Florida. Throw in Florida. Maybe we'll throw in Oklahoma too. Is it? No, Oklahoma. So by the way, Oklahoma, Tulsa may be a warm spot if I were looking at counties, but Oklahoma as a whole isn't. So this rally that's happening that has everyone so worried, maybe it'll create a hot spot in Oklahoma, that rally, but Oklahoma itself is not in the top 25 in hotness. So I'm not super worried about that. So all of these are still growing, and some of them are growing by quite a bit. 8% a day for Arkansas is alarming. South Carolina, 7% a day. Arizona, 7% a day. These are very high growth rates. If these continue, this is going to get hot. If they continue for months, it's going to get as hot as New York. Will it? The rope chart at this point is not making any predictions that these are going to level off and stop. But I have been for some days making my own sort of meta-analysis prediction, which is just to say, when we've seen graphs like this, they have leveled off and stopped, and they've done it in a matter of months. And so these started going upwards in early May. Now it's mid-June. I'll go out on a limb to the degree that I'll say I would be surprised if these haven't turned downward within the next month. And if we have, let's see, 1.07 to the 30th in a month, if they actually continue daily at 7% for a month, we'll see 7 times more cases then than we do now, if I've got my math right, which I often don't, which is why I let computers do it for me. 7 times more cases would be a lot, for sure. If these continue for a full month that way, we can see them. We may see them in the realm of where Rhode Island and in the 1,000 range. I would actually expect it to be more like a couple weeks. If it is a mere 14 days, then they'll only go up 2 or 3 times before they peak, and that would put them in the 300, 400, 500 range. 3 or 4 or 500 range, which would be high and would be hot. But that's what could reasonably happen when someone living. And the reason I think it happens, the reason I think this will happen, is because, as I've started harping on in this live stream, states seem to have something like an immune system, not a biological one, but something like a social one, where when you live in Arizona or Arkansas and you see that the trend is 8% rising, and you see yourself all over the news, including the national news, especially Arizona's been in the national news, but all 6 of these states are in the national news, you start to get afraid that you're going to get the virus. And when that happens, then you go inside and you stay there until the storm passes. And in fact, your elected officials sometimes force you to go inside and stay there until the storm passes. But even if they don't, I think the prudent among these states that will go inside and stay inside, or wear masks, or do other things that might mitigate it, wash their hands a lot, I don't know, until the storm passes. And my sense is it's just that fear. It's the rising fear that comes from the media coverage that actually is the immune system that pushes this thing down, with or without government interference, and then the states peak and get over it in the way that we keep seeing happens. So I expect that to happen here. I expect that to happen in a matter of weeks. We'll keep watching. This graph doesn't say that. I'm not reading that off the graphs. I'm just reading it from my experience in other places, other graphs. Now, I will say that North Carolina used to be more like one of these. It's not so obvious now, because the trend line is no longer really paying attention to these dots up here, because there are so many below. But North Carolina at least seems to have leveled off, and it was one of the 6, and it's not clear that it really is anymore. It's kind of got its own trajectory. But those other 5 are certainly still problematic. Let's look briefly at Texas and California, because those live in their own little world as well. But for a while, even just a few days ago, they were on exactly the same trajectory. They were just buddy-buddy, just like Texas and California always are. Ha-ha. But now we see Texas wins. Texas has turned the corner towards negative growth, according to this. It's had some really good days or weeks, since these are 7-day averages. 8% drop in daily cases for a week straight, or an average of that for a week straight, has just barely pulled Texas down below the growth curve, or it's pulled its growth curve down below 0, the trend line below 0, and so we see Texas now beginning to shrink. So with any luck, let's see if there's anything. Yeah, there's still an alarming point up here as well, which is that's insane. 60% growth over that week, 60% average daily growth over a week. That's kind of crazy, but that's what we see. But we see a lot of other days where that's no longer the case. And I could go into some of the reasons why sometimes we have wild growth rates. Sometimes it's more just about late data, where we don't get data for a couple days, and so it probably is not really true that Texas saw 60% average growth for a week every day, but the trend line compensates for that a little bit, and we see this very mild statement that we're doing about around 0 or a little below 0, dropping every day in Texas. California not doing so well. 2.5% daily growth doesn't seem to be getting any better. 2.5% isn't terrible, but over time will certainly add up. And our most recent week has been much worse than that, at 6% average growth for California. We'll certainly get into California in much greater depth in our next section here, but just notice California is a growth hotspot at above. No, it isn't. I'm getting my terminology confused. The most recent day is in hotspot territory at 5% growth. It's just a warm spot according to its trend line, but it's accelerating. And one bad day doesn't make a trend, but we'll be keeping an eye on that and see if that continues to head upwards. California looking pretty bad though, not as bad as the gang of 6, and certainly California well, let me just show you this. No, that's not the one I wanted. In terms of hotness, California and Texas, in terms of daily cases, hotness, they're not even warm. Still not even warm. Here we had this one day, most recent day, where California was at least a warm spot in daily cases. Texas not, and it had its most recent day has only 13 daily cases per million. Texas is showing a mini trend downward for a few days, not enough to really call it a trend, but a lot of good data points recently for Texas. California, not so much. So California and Texas have parted ways. California is going up, Texas is going down in a good way. Yeah, so those are the states. If you look at those are the hot states, the warmest states. If you look overall, the state's rope chart looks quite a lot like the national or the world rope chart. There are a lot of states going up, there are a lot of states going down in growth. No clear sense that any of them are better or worse. Maybe worth noting that Hawaii is suddenly doing terribly with a 10% growth. Or 11% daily growth. It's the worst of all. If you look down at the bottom here, we'll mostly see those first wave, second wave states that have recovered and continue to recover. So the United States is hanging in the balance here, being pulled up a little bit by the fact really that the biggest states that had it have recovered so far, that this new wave is overbalancing their recovery. The new cases we're getting from the likes of Arizona are more than the cases that are dwindling in New York, even though New York's much larger. New York has recovered so far that it's not a factor anymore. Actually, let's look at that just briefly, just to give a sense of what I'm talking about. We can look here at our total cases, our new daily cases, not adjusted by population. Now, the fascinating thing here is, well, let's look at New York. No, I was going to say New York isn't even here. But New York in daily cases per million. Now, this isn't daily cases per million. This is the total cases. New York in total cases, even though New York is immense, its total cases have just been lost in the crowd here. It's completely being overbalanced by California, Texas. California going up is a significant problem in new cases, actually. And then we start to see the group of Georgia actually significant. There's Arizona though, and North Carolina, Florida. Maybe it's worth taking another moment to look at Florida. Florida does have a lot of cases. It's third in daily new cases. Daily cases per million, Florida is not even warm, though it had a warm day recently and a really cold day recently. And in direction, it's a mixed bag, about somewhere around 0. Maybe it's growing 1%, definitely not accelerating. So Florida is hanging in a balance as well. Population tested by state. Worst is 3.8, best is 20%. Rhode Island has tested 20% of its population now. New York, not too far behind at 16. That's some good testing. Daily testing by state continues to rise in most states. They're just testing more and more. We can start to see that some have peaked and are dropping away at North Dakota, but most of these lines are upwards as testing continues to be madly brought online as fast as any state can manage it. And that 0.15 daily testing is roughly a cutoff of saying this is really good daily testing, and a lot of states are doing really well there. And the ones that aren't mostly seem to be headed towards there. Positive testing rates. Anything below 10% is pretty good, and almost all the states are there. 8%, anything below 8% is even better, and almost all the states are there. The ones that aren't are Georgia, slightly above 8%. I think I just caught a glimpse. Let me zoom in a little bit more so I can see just who's above 8%. Georgia and Texas, also headed upwards. This is an interesting and somewhat alarming trend. To see the positive test rate head upwards, I suspect means there's an increase in the underlying infection rate. At least the fact that, at least I definitely believe that these are upper bounds on the total population infected right now. So South Carolina definitely doesn't have more than 10% of its population infected right now. Probably has much less. And so as that upper bound rises, it gives more room for the possibility that the infection rate is rising. And I'm guessing it actually is. In Arizona, in Alabama, infection rate is probably rising. Oklahoma, for some reason, has a miserably high positive rate, but it's also dropping. In South Carolina, in Utah, these aren't really the infection rate, and it's more an intuition than something I can prove that a rise in positive rates indicates a little bit of an epidemic happening, but it's something that I suspect. And then there's this crazy number, Maine. I'm not going to pay any attention to that. But if the infection rate is rising, we can also expect the cases to rise as they're detected, at least eventually. And so we do see that in a lot of these places. Arizona is seeing rising cases. Alabama is seeing rising cases. South Carolina, Utah, these rising ones are part of the gang of six. But as we saw, Texas, not so clear. Texas seems to be falling, and maybe we'll start to see its testing rate falling as well, or its positive test rate. But the big picture here is good news. We have a whole lot of states with less than 10% positive test rate. So we're not seeing any really extreme cases, any extreme states where they're just finding tons and tons of cases. 90% of what we look, 90% of the time when we look at someone, even someone who's getting tested and therefore maybe can be expected to have some reason they're being tested, like symptoms, 90% of the time we're not finding the disease. Okay, moving on to the counties of California. As we've seen, California is doing poorly. It doesn't have a huge number of cases compared to some other places, adjusted for population, but it's growing at a significant rate. I think it was 2.5%. That's a lot. And it's accelerating slightly. So California as a whole not doing well. And that can certainly partly be attributed to Los Angeles here, which seems to be accelerating. We're seeing these dots above the trend line that indicates it's accelerating. Also Riverside, second place, accelerating. Let me zoom in here a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on the total numbers, but just look at all those dots above the trend line. Dots above the trend line on this graph indicate an acceleration. The trend line tends to sort of keep going the way it's been going, and so when there are dots above it, it means that the dots are headed in a direction that they weren't headed before, in this case accelerating. So Riverside seems to be sharply accelerating. San Diego barely accelerating. Orange accelerating pretty solidly. San Bernardino accelerating. Alameda not so much. It's kind of keeping its trend line. That's nice. Who is this? Imperial. Well, okay. Imperial has been accelerating, but I think the news will show not so much anymore. But all these counties with the most cases are accelerating with very few exceptions, and that leads to the total cases of the country of the state rising. Los Angeles here in daily cases, that's just moved to daily cases per million. That other graph gives us enough sense of where things are going in daily cases. Just notice all the dots here above Imperial, all those extreme cases for Imperial, but the most recent two downward. The most recent two dots of Imperial are around 500. It's been much higher than that. It's not, the trend line hasn't yet realized that Imperial is dropping, but the rope chart has. And the rope chart shows Imperial dropping, Imperial crossing that zero line towards negative growth a day ago, and now Imperial seems to be recovering with the past 7 days average of 2% drop. So Imperial's small, as is King's, but they've always had these extraordinarily high numbers of infections. Imperial at least is recovering. Let's see about King's. Yeah, King's, I've forgotten, already long since recovered. King's, by the way, seems to be driven, its numbers may be driven by prison population. I think I found out with a little bit of digging that half maybe of their cases are prison cases, and Imperial seems to be driven by cases coming from Mexico, U.S. citizens U.S. citizens living in Mexico crossing back over to Imperial County for healthcare. So those are exceptional, but let's take them out of the picture and see what the rest of the state looks like, because they are not very large in population. Los Angeles, though, it is alarming that the biggest county and the one with the most cases also is the highest in new cases per million. Los Angeles continues to trend upwards. If we look at the rope chart, Los Angeles continuing to grow in new cases at 1.5%. It's not a huge percent, but they are continuing to grow. At least they're not angled upwards. That's good. But they're not getting better either. So Los Angeles is holding steady at 1.5% daily growth. That's a lot when you're as big as Los Angeles, and it'll add up to a whole lot of numbers if it doesn't turn south sometime in the next few weeks. Most places do tend to turn south in 2 to 4 weeks, as I've mentioned, but maybe Los Angeles would be the exception. Its most recent day certainly is miserable. This is an average of 7 days, I think. The most recent, yeah, it is. The most recent day, the most recent week had an average of 9% daily growth, which is horrendously high, but it's just one sample here, just 1 week. The week ending yesterday was not nearly as bad, with only 1% growth. So we'll keep an eye on Los Angeles. Right now it's not looking great, but at least it's not accelerating. If we look at it in terms of hot spots and warm spots, Imperial is very hot, but as we saw, improving. Kings is also hot, over 200 counts as hot. Nothing else is hot. There are no other hot spots in total cases in the state. Los Angeles at only 144 doesn't actually have that many cases for its population. And Riverside keeps pushing upwards and looking to be a contender here at, what is its trend line showing now? 100 has just crossed into being a warm spot. No one else is even warm, though Kern and San Bernardino seem to want to. Their trend is towards 100, but not yet there at something like 90. They're not even warm. These two are warm, but not very warm. Well, not hot. So there actually aren't that many counties that have a really big problem in California. And in particular, Los Angeles, the biggest contributor, is not super problematic because it's not accelerating. But if we look at the counties as a whole, even though they're not very hot in new cases, in their daily cases, they are pretty hot in their growth rates. Almost all the counties are growing. The only exception really is Kings and Imperial. Those two that were our worst are now our best. They were worst in daily cases, at least. Those two have recovered, but we have a new wave that seems to be sweeping the state almost universally, where all the counties that have the most cases are growing quickly. Madera at 14% daily, San Luis Obispo at 10% daily, San Joaquin and Yolo almost 9% daily. Santa Barbara and Monterey at 7% daily. These are extremely high growth rates. So if they continue for any amount of time, more than a few weeks, we're really going to see some numbers here. And there's no indication that they're slowing down right now. They're all heading upwards. Again, I do tend to see, as I watch these graphs, that everyone has the same shape. They go up linearly, they briefly peak, and then they head down slightly slower than they went up. But none of these are showing that happening yet. I believe that they're going to follow that same trend. History suggests it, but I do not know when their peak's going to be. So we're just going to have to keep watching and worrying, because these are certainly disturbing trends. We do see well, that's Imperial. Who's this blue line that's almost looking good? Marin is almost looking good. And there's a cluster here that are sort of horizontal. But they're horizontal at 3%. If they were horizontal below 0, I'd be happy. But I really can't be happy about anything on this graph except for Imperial and Kings, which are so small that they don't make much of a difference in total numbers. Every single other of the warmest countries is looking bad. Warmest counties is looking just outright bad. High growth rate, or at least reasonably high growth rate, and accelerating. All the counties of California are looking bad. If we look at all the counties of California, the general trend continues. We do see a few other good news counties. Kings is leading still, but Humboldt's doing okay. San Mateo is doing okay. That's a county of considerable population, and so that's good news. El Dorado is doing okay. That's it. Sorry. There are no other counties that are doing okay. I think I threw out some very small ones, but all the other counties of California are growing in new cases. And certainly the general trend is that they're all accelerating. Yeah, that's it. Nothing good here in California. California is experiencing exponential growth in its new cases. It's going wild, no end in sight, except for this general sense that I have that none of these mini epidemics last more than a couple months. That doesn't come out of the data though. That's just how it's worked in the past. So bad news across the board in California. Sorry to say. Especially since I'm in California right now. I sometimes say, what these graphs say is, where would you like to live? Well, I would not choose California looking at this graph. On the other hand, I'm in Santa Cruz. Let's see how that's going. Santa Cruz also looking bad, certainly. Maybe not as bad as some, but Santa Cruz overall right now, it's had some, like its most recent week has had 20% growth average per day. The week ending yesterday had 10% growth per day. And the trend line is 4% new cases, 4% growth in new cases per day, even in Santa Cruz, which was doing so well. Let's take a moment to look at the Bay Area, the Santa Cruz Bay Area. I haven't looked here for a while, and with this new graph where I can actually pick out all the counties, let's just get a sense. Am I missing? I know I'm missing at least one now. Okay, what am I missing? These are alphabetical too. San Francisco, yeah, that's one for sure. San Mateo, that's close. I think there are about 6 that I've counted as, and there's one I'm missing still. Santa Clara, that's important. Okay, let's say those are the 6 Bay Area counties. You know, given how miserable the state looks, who is this? San Mateo, that's right. I was going to say, I didn't think there were any counties doing well, but I forgot. San Mateo, I pointed out earlier, is a populous county that's doing well. And San Francisco, compared to everyone else, is doing great because it's not growing. It's at 0 growth and flat, so good. And actually, Alameda is doing better than almost anyone else, because even though it's growing slightly at 0.6%, it's declining, heading towards 0. So half of the Bay Area counties are doing quite a bit better than the state as a whole. The other half are just kind of doing the state thing. Monterey, Santa Clara, Santa Cruz are all matching up with the rest of the state in doing this rather unfortunate trajectory of high growth and accelerating upwards. But interestingly, the Bay Area is doing better than the state, because some of the 3 of the Bay Area counties are in the top 5 or something statewide, top 5 counties statewide. Okay, testing Fresno to San Francisco. Fresno's the worst, but even it has done 3%. That's very good. San Francisco is doing terrifically well at 12%. Population tested daily. Not that many counties are above that 0.15% daily test line. But San Diego is, Marin is, Kings and San Francisco are. So I'm not totally sure this data is reliable. I have a suspicion that California is testing on the whole better than this. But according to this data, there's still some work to be done in testing in the daily testing rate, but at least they're all, well, I don't know about some of these numbers, but according to this data, they're all doing at least above 0.05% tested per day, and 0.15 being a target. It's not terrible, but maybe testing could be improved. So that's the news. Working backwards, California looks kind of terrible, but at least it doesn't have a huge number of cases. But if it continues for any length of time like this, California is definitely going to be a new worry spot. It doesn't show up right now in the Gang of Six because it's not growing quite as fast as them, and it's not quite as warm as them as daily cases, I think. But California is worrisome. Looking at the states as a whole, we still have we have generally a pretty good recovery in a lot of all the hardest hit first and second wave states. But this third-ish wave, the Gang of Six, is not really looking any better. It's still got it pretty bad. It's not hot, but it's headed there. Again, if it doesn't peak and recover, those 6 states are going to be trouble. And then on the country level, things are looking better, I think, with a lot of countries doing better, and the ones that aren't are quite small. The United States, in some sense, the worst country in the world, in this sense at least. So, that's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for listening and watching. And visit gregfarrar.us if you want to see these yourself. I made an awesome blog post, if I do say so myself, yesterday. It's got graphs in it. It's got a table of contents. I'm learning how to make better websites and do better blogging. And it's really quite a good blog post to give a summary of what was happening yesterday. Also good for people with mobile devices who can't, I've been noticing mobile devices just can't cope with these graphs, or at least my iPhone can't. I tried Safari, I tried Chrome, it just can't cope. So I do it all on laptop. Recommend if you're going to look at the graphs that you do it on a laptop, but if you must look at it on a phone, consider the blog post, because that doesn't have these active clickable graphs that just seem to drive the iPhone, at least, wild. And I have a feeling they do the same on Android, because even running Chrome didn't help. So yeah, that's the news. I'll be back with a blog tomorrow probably, and another live stream in a couple days. Thanks for watching.